Now we're going to look at why SDG 15 matters. Why taking care of terrestrial ecosystems matters to all of us. So that's the theme of our chapter today. The key message is that terrestrial ecosystems are very important for social and economic reasons. Terrestrial ecosystems play a very critical role for human livelihoods through both their products, such as timber, fruits, fiber, and then you have things that basically you can't touch, which are services. For example, water vapor is produced by trees, and this is a type of a service, and there are many types of services. So I'd like you to keep in mind these two things, products and services. And protecting and taking care of those ecosystems is relevant for both of these reasons. And of course, this varies in different parts of the world, and it varies in different types of ecosystems. Let me look first at the issue of land cover. What's the magnitude that we are talking about? Worldwide, forests have 3 trillion trees. 3 trillion trees. So we're talking about a massive amount of trees worldwide. The global forest area is huge. We're talking about 4 billion hectares. So about 1/3 of all landmass in the world is covered by forests. So it's huge. Also, it's important to note that although it's huge, 4 billion hectares, we're losing a lot. So deforestation is very relevant. It's a big part of the challenge that we have. If we just consider the period between 1990 and 2015, that means a period of 25 years, we lost about 129 million hectares. That's relevant. So from an ecological point of view, first, it's important because it's big, it has lots of services and products, but also it is under threat. In this map, you can see in different shades of color the areas which have experienced greatest forest loss. So the darkest areas are the areas with greater deforestation, and then you have also areas where there is net gain. We should invest a lot in restoration of forest ecosystems because of the services provided by these forests. And that's where China is doing great work. And on this side of the world, in the Americas, Brazil had a peak of deforestation around 2002, but then it had a very significant reduction up to 2013 and 14. So there is also a case which should be seen as an example in terms of reduction of deforestation. So China on one hand in terms of restoration, in Brazil in terms of reduction of deforestation rates. In terms of the ecological importance of forests, forests are critical in terms of terrestrial biodiversity. Over 80% of all life on terrestrial ecosystems is in forests. So it's clear the relevance of that. It's also important for housing medicinal plants or plants that are used for cultural purposes by indigenous peoples. In the Amazon basin alone, we have over 1,300 species that are used for medicinal purposes and cultural activities. Another component of the ecological importance of forests is rainfall. Forests produce to as much as 90% of all moisture in the atmosphere. So when we think of rain, we should think of forests. Forests are major pumps of water. They are essential for basically three reasons. One is because we need drinking water, and most of the world drinks water which is captured in rivers, which are fed by rain or snow. Second is that we all depend on plants to eat. Plants which are dependent on rainfall for agricultural production. And number three is that we have many countries in the world which are dependent on hydroelectrical power. And this is also fed by rivers and which are in turn dependent on rainfall. So forests are critical for all those things: electricity, urban consumption of water, and agriculture, because they are providers of water to the atmosphere. So I'd like you to keep that concept that links forests to rainfall and rainfall to all these critical aspects of our livelihoods. Forests are important because they house lots of carbon. In this map that you can see different shades of green, that means different volumes of forest carbon stored in the biomass. So you can see very high forest carbon stocks in places like the Amazon, and much less so in the drylands of Africa, for example. In terms of the socioeconomic importance of forests, we have about 1.5 billion people depending on forests to different degrees. A lot of the extreme poor people in rural areas live in forest ecosystems. And that is an interesting point, because it's both an issue of equity and an issue of methodology. Oftentimes, the statistics on poverty have to do with income. And when you go to a forest community, there is oftentimes very little cash income. So that qualifies the community as poor, or the family as poor. But that doesn't take into account the non-cash income, which is usually fish, fruit, game, and all kinds of products that come through non-monetary terms. So one has to look at those statistics with some critical eyes, because they oftentimes don't reflect the reality. Not too long ago, I was visiting a tribe in the Upper Rio Negro, a tribe that would qualify as poor on the basis of income. But once you go there and spend 1 or 2 or a couple of days, you realize that these are not poor people. They have plenty of food, they have good housing, they have a life which is oftentimes much better than a lower middle class in urban areas of the region. It's interesting to see and understand why forest communities are poor in the sense of access to education and health services. I'd like to share with you my experience when I was in government. The reason why political leaders, local political leaders, mostly mayors of towns, they abandon those communities for 2 reasons. One is because they're remote, and it's much more expensive to provide health and education services to them. And second is that they have few voters that eventually come to vote. So the tendency is for them to invest more in urban areas. And as a result of that, we have this tragic process of migration from forest communities to urban areas. And places like the Amazon have 80% of the population urban. And people might move to town not because necessarily like the commodities of towns, but most of the cases in the Amazon is driven by lack of access to education. If we are talking about sustainable development goals in forest communities, it's essential to come up with solutions to increase and improve health and education services. So I'd like you to take on this message that poverty in forest communities is significant, oftentimes is not well accounted for because the methodologies are based on income and don't consider the non-income component of those economies. And third is that these areas are usually neglected by local public policies. About 60 million people living in forest areas are indigenous communities. And this is a very important component of the forest challenge, so to speak. It's not only the threat of deforestation, but also is an issue of rights. These people have customary rights, traditional rights, that oftentimes date prior to the colonial period, which resulted in invasion of these areas by European superpowers or other countries or the societies. So there's a big movement worldwide to secure the rights of indigenous peoples to their traditional territories. This is not a simple academic debate, but rather this is a struggle between indigenous peoples and newcomers who want to grab their lands, their forests, their territories. And in many areas of the world, there have been very significant progress to secure land ownership for those indigenous communities. We're not talking about a small population. Thousands of different languages are spoken. And in other places, we still have a lot to go in securing those rights. So when we talk about the socioeconomic aspects of forest management, it's important to secure that. And that applies not only to tropical forests, but also it applies to boreal forests, places like Scandinavia, where we have the Lapps, which are traditional populations that move from Sweden to Norway and to Finland. There is an issue of territorial rights, which is still under dispute. The issue of rights and resources is a critical one worldwide. Another component of the forest challenge, so to speak, is to understand the economics behind forestry. The forestry sector employs some 13 million workers formally. But when we look at the informal work, the figure is much greater. We have about 73 million people, 73, about 5 times more informal workers than formal workers. Formal workers, we're talking about mostly pulp and paper industries, timber industries, and informal workers, we're talking about firewood, fruits, fish, products which are not big commodities. And there's a very interesting set of work on understanding small and medium enterprises in forest landscapes. And there's a great literature on that, and I think those of you who are interested in encouraging social enterprises, social businesses, there is a great number of initiatives worldwide happening on that area. And in my particular view, the best way of getting out of poverty is to encourage those families, those communities to make a good use, and a use that values the products that come from their forests. Oftentimes these communities are extremely rich, but the challenge is how to make it to the market. So I'd like also to leave you with that concept that we have a great opportunity to move this very informal and abundant part of the value chain into something which results in greater income to those populations, and then help reduce poverty, which is Sustainable Development Goal number 1. I'd like to close this chapter by saying that forests matters. and we should take good care of our forests. And we're going to explore further in this course how to design projects that make sense to different peoples and to different terrestrial ecosystems across the globe.